Good morning, everyone, and welcome back. For those of you who are just joining us, my name is Tanika Farr from Cambridge High School here in Milton, Georgia, by way of Atlanta. If you've been with us this whole time, you know that my cohort, Mr. Horton, taught yesterday, and today is my day. And this is your first time joining us, I welcome you. We're going to do a little A-push discussion today. And for today, we're going to look at the Great Society and also look at society in the 1960s. And just real quick, if you have questions for us, Mr. Horton is manning Twitter right now, so he can answer all of your questions. You can follow us at virtual a push. And so you can tweet your questions if you have anything. And then, of course, as I'm going along, if there are questions I ask, and of course, I'm going to ask the audience to kind of chime in as well, then, of course, you can post your answers on there. So, welcome, and let's go ahead and get started. So, yesterday you left off kind of talking about the Cold War, kind of the economy and the culture during that time. And Mr. Horton kind of left you off with the question, kind of talking about the New Deal. And if you recall, the New Deal was a program that was instituted by FDR during the Great Depression that was based off of the three R's, which was relief, recovery, and reform. And when he put those policies into place, that they were some of the beginnings of trying to end the depression within the United States. And while the New Deal did help with the Great Depression, it didn't actually effectively end it. What ended the Great Depression was our entrance into World War II. So there's a correlation and why he asked you to kind of think about the New Deal and some of the programs and policies that were put there. Because today we're going to talk about another great program called the Great Society that was by President Lyndon B. Johnson. And so, if you were to take an AP exam and they were to ask you the question of do a comparison of the New Deal with the Great Society, these are some things you need to think about. So, let's go ahead and jump into it with our warm up. And this is a secondary source, which is something that is common within your AP exam. You may get a primary source, you may get a secondary source, but and you know the difference between a primary and a secondary is a person who's actually a part of the event. Secondary is someone writing about the event. And so this is from Bernstein in 1968, kind of talking about towards a new path. So take a few minutes and read through the passage and kind of talk about what the New Deal didn't do. And then we're going to answer this question. It says, based on the two interpretations above relating to the legacy of the New Deal, I want you to think about there's actually two passages, but I'm only going to give you one. I want you to look at the main idea of the point that was made in this passage. So take a few minutes. All right, guys. So the main idea or the point of view that Bernstein was trying to make that you could basically, a possible answer could be this. He argues that the New Deal was not a transformative program because it left basic corporate capitalist system intact and entailed no particular redistribution or reorganization of power or income within the United States. It also failed to extend equality and accepted racial discrimination. So, thinking about his interpretation, remember this is 1968. So, he was talking about policies that were put into place during the 30s and also in the 40s. We're going to look at LBJ's attempt to kind of fix what the New Deal did not do. Looking at racial discrimination, you're going to see some of those in the New Deal within the Great Society trying to fix those, as well as trying to extend equality. All right, so let's kind of jump in and talk about our lesson overview very quickly. Number one, I've already mentioned we're going to talk about the Great Society, which is 8.9, and then we're also going to talk about youth and culture in the 1960s, which is 8.12. Your expectations for this lesson is look at causes and effects of continuing policy debates about the role of the federal government over time. We will kind of go back and do some comparisons of the role of the federal government from the New Deal in comparison to what the Great Society did. You're also going to explain how and why opposition to existing policies and values developed and changed over the course of the 20th century. Some acquired skills, things that you guys have already been working on, looking at claims and evidences and sources. That's based off how you answer the questions, kind of looking at the evidence, kind of making a claim. You just made a claim with the warm up as far as trying to figure out the main idea and what the point with the author was arguing. We're going to look at developments and processes. So for today, we're making connections. And so you will hear me reference the New Deal policies way back then, comparison to what the Great Society did. And with the skill of making connections, you need to explain how historical development or processes relates to another historical development or process. So don't forget, tweet your questions at virtual APush. At virtual APush. All right, so here we go. Let's jump into it. I'm going to show you this quick video that kind of gives you a good overview of what the New Deal was and what it intended to do.
$20 trillion. What would you do with all that money? You could pay off the national debt. You could spend $1 million a day for 2,000 years and still have trillions left. But could you end poverty in America? That was one of the goals of the Great Society, President Lyndon Johnson's ambitious plan to transform the lives of Americans. The Great Society is 50 years old. It's been a long, historic journey, but are we at the end of the road? We'll start by traveling back to 1964, when America's prosperity and potential seemed limitless. But America had troubling, age-old problems like legal discrimination and abject poverty that could no longer be tolerated in the increasingly prosperous land of the free. So, in May of 1964, President Johnson made a big announcement.
The Great Society rests on abundance and liberty for all. It demands an end to poverty and racial injustice, to which we're totally committed in our time.
LBJ decided that the government, with its vast power and the might of the national treasury, would steer us towards a better place.
The challenge of the next half century is whether we have the wisdom to use that wealth to enrich and elevate our national life and to advance the quality of our American civilization.
Johnson's plan ended the South's Jim Crow laws. No more whites-only lunch counters, colored water fountains, and sitting at the back of the bus. Landmark legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the 1965 Voting Rights Act were tremendous achievements that did away with legalized racial discrimination. Today, we stand closer to being the colorblind society that Johnson envisioned. But we're still trying to level the playing field with affirmative action policies that themselves aren't colorblind. Another stain on America was extreme poverty. 50 years ago, millions of Americans were still shockingly poor. This meant life with no plumbing or electricity and often going to bed hungry. Today, material living standards are a lot better. But now, the problem isn't having a shirt on your back or food on your plate. It's having things like a job, 2 parents, and avoiding crime and drugs that enable the poor to escape the poverty trap. LBJ also said, we are not content to accept the endless growth of relief rolls or welfare rolls. Entitlements were supposed to be a bridge to a better life, not sustain people in poverty. After 50 years of effort and an astronomical price tag, the official poverty rate hasn't changed, even if being poor doesn't mean what it did back then. And other problems afflict today's poor. Divorce and separation have soared, and while only 8% of kids grew up without a father in 1960, today that number has nearly tripled. In America, for every working-age man unemployed today, there are 3 who have checked out of the workforce altogether. We need to ask ourselves, has America become the great society that LBJ envisioned? Should we have traveled a different road? We'd like to hear from you. Leave your comments below this video and subscribe to learn more about the promise and the peril of the Great Society.
Okay, so let's talk about that and kind of think about those questions that were asked at the end of the video.
$20 trillion.
All All right, so very quickly, the Great Society was a series of domestic programs that were proposed by Lyndon B. Johnson, and I'm going to call him LBJ for short, expanding on Kennedy's stalled New Frontier proposals. And if you remember, the reason why it was stalled was because Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. So the vision that he had for the New Frontier was unable to come to fruition. So Johnson kind of took that over and really wanted to kind of put that in the forefront. It aimed at to expand civil rights and eliminate poverty. And a lot of people assume that with LBJ and the Great Society, that this was something that he kind of took as far as ideas and programs from the New Frontier. But what a lot of people don't know is that LBJ has honestly been fighting for the expansion of civil rights way back in the 1950s. He actually proposed a Civil Rights Act prior to that, but it did not pass. So this was something that he really, really, really wanted to bring to the forefront. So these are just some examples of the programs that the Great Society put into place. Medicare, a federal health insurance program for Americans 65 and older, along with younger people with disabilities. And that's something that we still have into place today. When you think about some of the New Deal programs, they, programs that were put back in the 40s, they are still actually applicable today. And so for those of you who are on Twitter, kind of thinking about when you learned about the New Deal and some of these programs, as I'm talking about the Great Society, why don't you go ahead and tweet us and think about what are some of the ABC programs from the New Deal that kind of made its way over into the Great Society and are still evident today. And I'll give you a hint. One of them has something to do with banks, and another one has something to do with emergencies and states of emergency. All right, we have Medicaid, a social safety net program that provides health care for low income Americans. We also have the Immigration Act of 1965, which basically repealed discriminatory practices of quota acts of the 1920s. And remember, the quota acts were as a result of the first Red Scare. I know that that was a big question a lot of people asked was, what was the difference between the first Red Scare and the second Red Scare? The first Red Scare was really trying to put a lot of immigration policies into place. And so the quota acts of the 1920s kind of put halts on that. And then this act, the Immigration Act of 1965, kind of overturned that. It allowed millions of previously excluded peoples to immigrate to the United States. They also had the development of the Office of Equal Opportunity. They oversaw the creation of Job Corps, program that's still evident today. That's really great for individuals who don't want to seek a general high school education program. They actually want to do more of a trade. So instead of them completely dropping out of school and getting a GED, they can actually join Job Corps and they can learn a trade and still graduate with a certificate and go right out into the work field. So it kind of explains that about inner city and rural citizens. And then they have the Department of Urban and Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. Cabinet level office created in 1965 as a part of Johnson's Great Society program. It oversees affordable housing in the housing market with an emphasis on creating and sustaining that. So as you're thinking about that and looking at it and seeing all of the transitions, these are things that the Great Society put into place. And if you're looking at these, a lot of these are still here today. We still have HUD, we still have Medicaid, we still have Medicare. And, we still have a lot of laws that made a huge impact from the Great Society. One of the biggest things that when we think about the changes in discriminatory, we have to kind of bring in the federal courts. And for quite some time, the federal court has really kind of not really had a lot to say. They had an impact as far as declaring certain New Deal programs as being unconstitutional. But I have to bring in the Warren Court because this was during a time when the Great Society was really kind of, they would say this court really characterized the Great Society and the end of discriminatory practices. This was probably seen as one of the most liberal courts that ever, since the Supreme Court had put into its existence. And a lot of the laws that this court actually put into play have an effect on you guys right now. They affected political representation. They address several issues. And it's called the Warren Court because at the time, the Chief Justice was Earl Warren. So usually that's how a Supreme Court is identified, is by whomever their Chief Justice is. That's how that Court goes. And it talks about a lot of the rights and civil liberties that you guys have today. And so, as he was trying to create this whole idea of ending discrimination and equality amongst all, we're going to look at some of the things that the Warren Court kind of put into place. I'm going to give you like brief synopsis of some of the cases that the Warren Court had during the 60s. All right, so first one, this one happened in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas. This is the case that overturned Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. This basically said that segregation is going to be illegal within the United States. And of course, this is the case that's going to kind of set the momentum for the civil rights movement, if you recall from our talk on Tuesday. Another case, Mapp versus Ohio in 1961. That was a case where the police were looking for someone and they entered someone's home. They illegally searched. They did not have a search warrant, and they found some materials that were at that time illegal for that individual to have. And so they placed that individual under arrest. And so this case basically said it is illegal for for any police officials to search your house without having a warrant. Engel versus Vital, this was in 1962, that talked about the separation of church and state in school. This particular case was where an individual who was of a different religion attended a school that required prayer. And because that individual did not believe in having prayer or saying that specific prayer, they actually exercised their rights by quietly not actually participating, and they were kicked out of school, and it was brought all the way up to the Supreme Court. You have number 4, Gideon versus Wainwright, a person who was arrested in a pool hall and could not afford legal counsel. And when requested to get legal counsel, was told no by the court, was denied that. And so now basically in 1963, it basically says that you have a right to legal counsel. If you cannot afford one, then one will be appointed to you. Same with Escobedo versus Illinois in 1964. We have Tinker versus Des Moines, the case where the students wore black armbands to protest the Vietnam War, and it was considered to be a violation of the school dress code. And so now they kind of talked about the differences in symbolic speech. And then finally, a very important one, Miranda versus Arizona. I know you guys have heard of the Miranda rights, where the police when they arrest someone, I don't know if you've ever watched the show Cops, and you notice they always have to say you have the right to remain silent, and they say a whole paragraph. That is something that came about because of the Miranda rights, where basically if they don't read you the Miranda rights, then that actual arrest could actually be thrown out of court. So again, these are just some of the cases that the Warren Court heard during that time, but it still makes an impact just the same on you guys. I wanted to take a few minutes and kind of do a little bit of shout outs. We asked for you guys to tweet out and give us some names of some teachers that you guys think have really made a difference. And so we got some students who really love you as teachers if you're watching. So Miss Hall, Miss Clicker. We also have PJ Palin from GP South. We have Christopher Perillo. And then Miss Hall is actually from West Hill High School in New York. So, hey, you guys, it's great. Thank you. We really do appreciate that you love your teachers. And we also appreciate all of the positive feedback and responses that we've received from those individuals who say that they love watching our videos. I also want to say a special thank you to Cynthia Pickles and Constance Hines for posting some very positive tweets and feedback. Again, thank you so much. And if you continue to post that, we will continue to acknowledge you, because again, we want to make sure that we're making a difference and that you guys are really getting some value from this. All right, so let's look at the impact of the Great Society. Number 1, we have that he was able to extend the power of the federal government. This was something that was important. This power extension was not the first time that a president has done that. Franklin Delano FDR did the same thing with the New Deal, to the point where it was kind of argued that he was actually abusing the power of the federal government in order to push his agenda. And you really kind of saw that more so when he was trying to he tried to introduce a bill to introduce more justices inside the Supreme Court. It was called a court packing bill. You also have reforms that help create a new awareness of social problems, looking at the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, and then the Fair Housing Act of 1968 could also be something that you kind of look at when it comes to social awareness. You're also looking at debates over its effectiveness. And you did have some conservative backlash. You did have people who felt like Johnson, just like FDR, was kind of like a bully, was more so kind of pushing his agenda. You do have some conservatives that weren't really ready for the desegregation. They really weren't prepared for some of the programs of the New Deal. And so it kind of looked as though Johnson was kind of following in those same footsteps. But, to his credit, Johnson was trying to create a fairness for all. And so this is kind of the thing that you got to look at when you look at a comparison of what the Great Society did in comparison to what the New Deal did. The New Deal's attempts were, let's end the Great Depression. Let's do some relief immediately right now. Let's look at unemployment. Did not address necessarily all of the racial discrimination that happened during that time. That actually kind of happened much later through a series of executive orders. And even still, there were some policies that were still discriminatory against minorities. With the Great Society, they looked to fix those things. They also looked to kind of take care of various programs. So I'm not sure if anybody has managed to tweet out. I'm going to check and see, but has anybody gotten what are some of the New Deal programs that are still in effect today? All right, so I do see somebody. I see Rochelle Carney. I might be mispronouncing your name, and I apologize, but they have the Social Security Act. Good job. That's great. Then I have John Villarreal, who says FDIC. That's the bank one that I'm talking about. That's the one that basically says if the economy goes into a recession or if the stock market crashes again, the bank ensures that your money is safe and that your money will still be there, which is not what happened to people during the Great Depression. And also, yes, the Social Security Act. Awesome. Somebody put in, I think Hardeship Banga also mentioned the Social Security Act. So you guys are awesome. It looks like your teachers have done an awesome job as far as making sure that you know your New Deal programs. So again, we're going to keep moving. All right, so let's HIPPO very quickly. HIPPO is what we use when we talk about looking at document analysis. This is something that you will do with your DBQ. And so we're going to kind of give you a few minutes. And when I say HIPPO, just in case you forgot, the H stands for historical context, the big picture, looking at it like that, looking at it at a bigger scale. Then we have the point of view, one of the P's when you're looking at what is the author or the cartoonist in this cartoon trying to say. Then you have the purpose. The purpose is also important. You have the intended audience. There's your I. And then I always like to add in the O because you're going to give some outside sources. So we're not going to be able to do all of them. I'm going to just choose one, but very quickly, just kind of select. I'll let you guys, let's look at historical context. So take about 40, 30 seconds and kind of think about the historical context and what this is saying. Okay, so if you were given this cartoon and it would say, again, kind of looking at that question I asked you at the beginning, which is do a comparison of the policies from the New Deal and the policies of the Great Society, and you looked at the historical context. All right, so you see there's Lyndon B. Johnson. He is playing the piano, and you'll notice that the things that are in the air over here looks at defense appropriation, civil rights bill, Southeast Asia resolution, anti-poverty legislation. And then he looks at over here on the side, how it says 88 keys, this is the 88th Congress. And so the historical context, what are we talking about here? What is this political cartoon addressing? Well, it's talking about the fact that We are in the midst of not just the Cold War, but we're also in the midst of civil rights movement. And when he's saying like defense appropriation in Southeast Asia, you can kind of do a comparison and say, well, while the New Deal didn't necessarily address those issues that were happening as far as World War II, they were mostly concerned about the issues that were impacting America itself. So they were looking at more domestic issues, whereas the Great Society was having to deal with both issues, having to deal with both foreign and domestic issues. So you're dealing with the civil rights movement, which is why the bill and anti-poverty legislation was so important. But you're also looking at the fight with the Cold War. And the fact that while Johnson was president, the issue with Vietnam was getting ready to heat up. And he had to make some decisions as far as whether or not we're going to get involved, because the two previous presidents have already indicated that they would not get involved with countries that were engaged in war. They will help stop the spread of communism by providing aid, and they meant economic aid or some kind of political aid, but they really did not want to give military aid if it was not necessary. So again, kind of thinking about the HIPPO, remember what that stands for. So as you're kind of going through and analyzing your documents, if you were looking at a DBQ, they've given you many different methods that you can use. You only have to choose one. So you do not have to do HIPPO for every single document that you're looking at. You don't have to do all 5 of these. You can actually just kind of choose one. And my suggestion is choose your strongest one, the one that you know you can guarantee it. And if you want to try to do point of view or purpose or intended audience, great, go ahead, because there are other areas in which you can earn points that way. All right. So let's jump into the 60s and kind of talk about what we refer to as an affluent society. When we look at the 60s, we kind of want to look at these 4 things. This was known as the Beatnik Society. This was a society of culture versus counterculture, meaning you have those individuals who had fought in World War II, who are part of the 50s, who believed in that American dream. And now you have this group of individuals who are challenging the status quo. If you kind of remember when I was talking to you guys about how, during the end of the Red Scare, one of the ways that you can kind of prove your loyalty is to conform. Well, during the 60s, people decided that nonconformity was just going to be the way to go. And so you're going to see a lot of challenges. You're going to see this group that wanted to change the world and kind of go out and seek and do things differently than what their parents did. And so the beatniks are probably going to be one of the biggest groups. They're part of the counterculture movement. They started in the 1950s. They had people like Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg were notable members, and they used criticism in many forms. They did it by poetry, they did it by art, philosophy, protest. There are a lot of things that happened during the 60s where people were kind of protesting. They were protesting civil rights. They were protesting things that were happening with the Cold War. They're definitely going to be huge and dominant when they're kind of coming in and protesting the Vietnam War as well. The Port Huron Statement, we're actually going to look at some excerpts from that. This was a 1962 manifesto by Students for a Democratic Society. They talked about expansion of democratic participation, kind of talking about the new left, a liberal movement. They kind of take up a lot of the causes from the civil rights, looking at gender roles. So, kind of that whole idea of the feminism, the idea of, the class struggle, kind of looking at identity. So when we look at the excerpt from the Port Huron Statement, you'll kind of get an idea of the basis for the students for the Democratic Society. You also have what's known as the free speech movement, huge, large-scale student protests that kind of took place between 1964 and 1965, started at USC in Berkeley, where students wanted administration to acknowledge students' right to free speech. They were kind of looking at the idea of, not just thinking of them as kids, but the fact that these people are going to be voters. They have a right to kind of go out and protest things that they didn't like. This was a part of the 1966 gubernatorial election where Ronald Reagan, you see his first foray into, excuse me, politics. And if you recall, Reagan was one of those individuals that was a part of that Hollywood 10 that were brought in during the second Red Scare and was blacklisted for a short period of time. And then, of course, the biggest thing that was going to be associated with the 60s is going to be the 3-day concert known as Woodstock, happened in New York in 1969, and it typified 1960s culture. You're talking about people like Jimi Hendrix, so many different artists, the Rolling Stones, all of these individuals who played played here. And for the first time, what was so big about Woodstock was that it was a coming together of people from all walks of life that came to this farm in upstate New York to celebrate music for 3 days and to just really kind of come together as one. So the 60s, of course, was a day of pop culture. And so the poster that you see there kind of talks about some things that kind of are synonymous with the 60s, kind of like a decade of change. You'll hear a lot of phrases like make love, not war, still using some of the phrases from the civil rights movement, like we shall overcome. If you recall, the civil rights movement is really going to start getting more momentum during the 60s. But it was a moment of civil unrest. They were angry. They were angry with the fact of discriminatory practices that were done inside of the various cities, especially in southern states. They were angry about the Vietnam War, and they were angry that they did not have a voice and they wanted to be heard. So a lot of people had to deal with war. A lot of them had to deal with the fact that they were being drafted, or they will be drafted, and probably one of the biggest drafts that has ever been held in American history. And they're basically being told, you have to go fight in a war, and we're not even sure what the war is about, or even if we agree with it. So again, we kind of talked about how you needed to conform and you needed to kind of go along with the status quo. Well, that didn't happen in the 60s. And so a lot of people decided that they wanted to just drop out of school. It was just, life wasn't working out for them. So they decided to have that dropout mentality. A lot of them refused to accept traditional values of society. Maybe they didn't want the American dream. Maybe they didn't want to get a college education, grow up, get married, have the wife and the 2.5 kids. I think the 0.5 is the dog, of course, and live and go to work every day in the office in that gray suit. They wanted to break away from that. They wanted to have freedom and to have individuality. And so they came up with the quote of do your own thing. And from there, they're really going to kind of think about the fact that America's lives and the youth is pretty much going to kind of adopt that style. And so you're going to start to see a lot of clash. You're going to start to see that people are really going to start dressing differently. The music is going to change. Men no longer having that clean cut. They're going to grow their hair long. They're going to wear long, different clothes with beads. It's really going to kind of be a transformation. And so they refer to it as counterculture. And counterculture just basically means thinking about how cultural society did exist during that time and how it's going to kind of change and kind of go against that. They're going to experiment. They're not going to see marriage as their end all be all. They're going to kind of think about the fact that maybe having multiple wives might be the thing for them to do. They're going to make choices that may be considered the word taboo, or they're going to do things because they feel good. And so they refer to the 60s for some as a sexual revolution. They meant that they did as they pleased. They believed in, living together without being married. They believed they lived in communes. They lived on buses. It was also a culture where they tried drugs. Music, of course. They tried to say that music was the reason that a lot of these individuals during the 60s were kind of brainwashed. And again, you had a lot of big artists that came about during the 60s, the Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, The Doors, Marvin Gaye, Chris Christopherson. And of course, a lot of the music that they sang in the 60s was not just about society, but it talked about a lot of the things that were happening during that time. You'll notice that a lot of the music during the 60s were talking about, protesting the Vietnam War. They had massive periods of time where the Vietnam War was at the forefront because many of them were affected by that. And so that whole idea of anything goes attitude, that was going to be the decade of it. So the psychedelic colors, the tie-dye, the lava lamps, bell bottoms, massive afros, braids, beads, all of these things came about during the 60s. And so we're going to watch this very brief video that kind of talks about the impact of the 60s.
The summer of 1968 caps off a series of intense confrontations between students and administrators on college campuses across the country.
The most dramatic of which was the occupation for several days of several buildings by student radicals on the campus of Columbia University in New York City. They negotiated over a variety of issues, including the university's support for the war effort through defense research and ROTC, and especially the university's plan to try to build new facilities in a neighboring park, one that had been used by the overwhelmingly Black community of Harlem. the breaking up of the Columbia Uprising radicalized many students who had not been involved in and not even supported the demonstration, but were outraged by what they saw as the excessive use of force.
An older generation that had gone through the Depression, an older generation that had gone through World War II, had difficulty in seeing these broader, more expansive definitions of a citizen's right. So, yeah, those were incredibly passionate times.
And Tom Hayden, one of the leaders of the radical students movement, SDS, talked about there being 1, 2, 3, many Columbias, and that we are moving from protesting against what they saw as the unfit use of power by the establishment to actually taking power for ourselves.
Closely related to the New Left is a youth culture that openly scorns the values and conventions of middle-class society.
Young people are seizing upon things that have been changing in the 1950s and sort of making them political and making them overt. It's the ambiguity and the mixed messages that provide the energy for people to try to experiment and understand and work their way out of these kinds of dilemmas.
By the 1960s, certainly the counterculture becomes identified very heavily with San Francisco, with Los Angeles, as later on with rural communes. It's not that it didn't take place in other places, but it's seen very much as a Western phenomenon. The huge anti-war demonstrations in San Francisco or Los Angeles have a different tone and a different flavor than the kinds of things taking place in Ann Arbor or Madison or New York City. Whether people loved or hated the 60s, they certainly associated much of it with the West. And even the belief then will create the reality, because people who in fact want to be free to have different kinds of social experimentation, to alternate lifestyles, to experiments in sexuality, will tend to come west.
All right, guys, real quickly, want to give a shout out to Miss Somerville at Hoosac Valley, Ms. Roldan at Pioneer High School, Mr. McGrath at McFarland High School, Mr. Lee from Seneca Valley High School, and Mr. Gray at IH High School in Mississippi. So your hey, God, teachers, your students really love you. All right, so let's do a little bit of guided practice. Remember I told you about the Port Huron statement, and I told you guys about the Students for Democratic Society, where here is that statement. So here's your question. What future activity was least consistent with the sentiments expressed in the passage above? All right, so your answer to this question would be C, the emergence of neoconservative ideals and policies. Remember, the word least was capitalized, so everything else would have went along with this statement based off of what you know about the SDS, what their whole idea, their whole premise was, and why they existed. So again, we're going to kind of check for understanding just to make sure you guys are with me. So this is Lyndon B. Johnson's commencement address at the University of Michigan in 1964. He's going to kind of mention and kind of talk about the Great Society. So answer this question. Which of the following early 20th century groups would most likely support the goals stated in the passage above? So take a few minutes. Okay, and the response would be? Progressives, thinking about it, 20th century groups, progressives really wanting to change things. They were the ones who were kind of fighting all the policies from the Gilded Age. So they definitely would have agreed with some of the policies from the Great Society. All right, this is the same commencement speech, different question. Which of the following resulted from the efforts described in the passage above? Give you a few minutes. Okay, and the response would be D, increased funding of social programs. Again, remember Great Society, kind of thinking about civil rights, kind of thinking about immigration, all those things. So again, kind of looking at this, thinking about the bigger picture and making those connections. All right, so let's debrief very quickly. So what would be, if you say that there was a legacy of the Great Society, I would definitely say that these were some 9 things. I'm just gonna kind of touch on a few of them. Thing about American liberalism was very high under President Johnson, especially you saw that evident with the Warren Court. I'll go and touch on the fact that the Elementary and Secondary Education Act provided major funding for public schools. And of course, look at 6, the National Endowment for Arts and Humanities use public money to fund artists and galleries. That still exists. The NEH, the National Endowment for Arts and Humanities, is still in existence today, and it still does a lot, especially working with educators. And then last, the standards were raised for safety and consumer products. So this would be a great legacy. This is basically saying that, yes, this is had a huge impact. Despite a lot of the criticism that it was faced by the conservatives, they still kind of did a very good job in addressing some of those issues that were not addressed necessarily with the New Deal. Uh, as far as the 1960s, referred to as hippie culture, these would be some of the, the things that was an impact of that. You have the age of Aquarius. We have rock and roll music, which still has an impact today. You have Eastern religions like Zen Buddhism. You have a great different types of, ways that people dress, the tie-dye, the military garment, the love beads, the muslin shirts. The fact that, they kind of said it was synonymous more so out west, and they mentioned the Haight Ashbury district in San Francisco. Still a huge district. I actually had the opportunity to visit there a couple of times when I've been to San Francisco, and it's actually pretty cool if you ever go. But again, a huge impact from that. And so our key takeaways, once again, kind of bringing it back, the fact that liberal ideas found expression in the LBJ's Great Society, which attempted to use federal legislation and programs to end racial discrimination, eliminate poverty, and address social issues. The fact that young people participated in the young culture of the 1960s and rejected many of the social, economic, and political values of their parents' generation that were introduced. So basically, those baby boomers of the 1950s, they basically said, nope, we're not doing that. We're going to kind of do our own thing. Which kind of goes in with our overview about the fact that the Great Society was a series of domestic programs proposed by LBJ that expanded on the new frontier from JFK, and it moved to expand civil rights and eliminate poverty. And of course, other thing is the counterculture movement of the 50s and the early 60s emphasized in art, philosophy, and social criticism. So I think we hit our learning objectives today. We kind of looked at causes and effects. We also looked at the continuing policies and those things that are still impacted today. So let's do a little bit of exam practice. And before we do that, once again, I want to say thank you to Ms. Goodger from Edmond North High School, Mr. Enriquez from Santa Paula High School, Mr. Malls from Fairport High School in New York, Mr. Lally from Cypress Creek, Mr. Pickup at Skinny Atlas High School, Mr. Sylvia at New Bedford, Miss King at West High School, and Mr. Harbison at Lord Betancourt High School. So again, your students love you. We thank you guys. We really appreciate you shouting out your teachers. They work very hard, and I know that it's very difficult if you're not able to see them right now. So let's do this one really quickly. This is kind of talking about the Vietnam War, and what you're going to do is explain the main point that was made in the passage. So take a few minutes. Okay, so here is a possible explanation. It argues that the role of media in reporting the war in Vietnam, especially the Tet Offensive, changed popular perception in the war in the United States and shifted public opinion against the war. And one thing that you could mention, especially, is a lot of the protests that will happen in the 1960s. Kent State would be a great example of that one if they were going to give you some outside information. Um, for the sake of time, we're going to kind of go through this one. This is another passage. You're going to explain the main idea made in this passage as well. Same thing with the Vietnam Wars. Kind of take that into consideration. Okay, possible response is that it argues that while there were non-military constraints on the ability of armed forces, especially the Air Force, to wage a successful war, the Cold War focus on nuclear weapons development created a problem for the US in carrying out the war in Vietnam, which developed into a conventional war dependent upon air power and air technology. So again, these are just some possible responses as you're looking at secondary sources that we're talking about the Vietnam War. Very quickly, something to think about. If you really want to kind of go more in depth with the Great Society, take a few minutes and scan this QR code. It's a great YouTube video that kind of goes more in depth with the Great Society and kind of talking about the program, the impact, and really kind of going over some more details as far as the intention behind those programs that LBJ kind of came up with. And for tomorrow, when you get with Mr. Horton, think about this question. We're looking at the point of view of the person who are talking about the 60s. We're talking about the economic system of the 1960s. So thinking about everything that we've talked about, Great Society, the culture and the counterculture, what is going to be that economic system underneath the American in America at that time? So I appreciate you guys shouting out your teachers. We appreciate the questions that you've given us on Twitter. And as always, please continue to follow us at Virtual APUSH and encourage your friends to continue to tune in. Thank you for watching. And if you're having any technical issues or know of anybody having any technical issues, remember it's cb.org/tech. Have a great day, guys.